Hello and welcome to Moneycontrol's panel discussion on elections and the economy. Polling is underway for the Lok Sabha elections. What are the key economic issues that are affecting voters? Is economic growth a necessary, is a stable government a necessary condition for economic growth? To discuss that and much more, we have with us an eminent panel of economists. We have Mr. Siddharth Sanyal, Chief Economist at Barclays. We have Mr. Shaugata Bhattacharya, Chief Economist at Axis Bank. And we have Dr. Sachidanand Shukla, who is Chief Economist at the Mahindra Group. Welcome to the panel discussion, gentlemen. So let me start with a non-partisan issue, which is jobs. Jobless growth, I mean, we have been hearing this term almost for the past 2 decades now. It is not only the problem of the last 5 years. So tourism, entrepreneurship, these are all touted as solutions, to this jobless growth problem. But so far, nothing really has happened. So let me start with Mr. Sanyal. What are the solutions to this? How big is this problem of jobless growth, and what are the solutions, for this problem?
Well, I think to some extent, issues with job is an integral part of life globally today, and it's not an India-centric issue. It's not a local issue. So you have to live with it, and at the same time, you have to try to find some solution. Now, at some point of time, till about 5, 6, 10 years back, we used to think that we have low cost of labor, and that's why we'll just embark on manufacturing, even though we are trying to do it 30 years later or 40 years later than when China had initiated. That may not necessarily be the good enough solution. Possibly we have to follow that, but we have to possibly step up on a few other initiatives as well. And you rightly pointed out on the opportunities on the scale, on the sides of tourism, etc. Tourism in India can actually have multiple shades. It can be tourism, it can be medical tourism, it can be education tourism, it can be religious tourism and whatnot. So I think and it can actually create jobs at various levels of skill and enterprise. So I think we have to keep exploring some of the newer areas, because there are very serious challenges, at least in some of the other well-established places like service exports and all, which had given us some kind of a growth momentum over the course of the last couple of decades. So we have to keep exploring, mix the traditional as well as some of the newer areas.
Mr. Bhattacharya, what do you think are the key challenges here?
So jobs is, as Siddharth mentioned, a problem all across the globe, but particularly in India. I mean, given the startling statistic of 180 million new voters, the first-time voters that are coming in, just gives you an idea of the scale of the problem in India. And it's a multidimensional problem. I mean, this has to be tackled across a variety of sources. So the first thing, I think, it might be a problem. We do not have adequate data to be able to accurately assess what the scale of the problem is. Anecdotal evidence seems to suggest, and it's not just a matter of jobs. In India, unemployment is not a problem, underemployment issue is. So livelihood, say for instance, is becoming a very important issue. The quality of jobs that are being created is an important issue. So we have probably taken into account a lot of jobs. But I mean, this needs to be tackled in a multiple nature, across multiple dimensions. For one, it has to be differentiated across states. There cannot be a pan-India solution to this problem. It has to vary according to the geography, the region, the specifics of that geography, etc. Agriculture is a very major issue, because I mean, there will be a lot of people who will need probably to migrate out of agriculture and even out of the rural space. So that needs.
But that is not really happening, isn't it?
So that's one thing that needs to be a focus, and after that, the whole set of skills for the young aspirational people of India to come in and be skilled in a manner which will fit the job profiles that will emerge in the future.
Dr. Shukla, this skills development is something which we have been talking for several years now, but nothing really seems to be happening. Do you have any views on that?
I think we have to look at the problem holistically. Look at the sheer numbers, as Saugata just spoke about. The quantity as well as the quality aspect of jobs is a problem. We do not really capture data properly, and as he rightly said, it cannot be that a Delhi base or a Delhi mandated survey captures the data points very well. In terms of the elasticity, employment elasticity, what has happened is with the same unit of GDP growth. Earlier you used to get 0.4 as the jobs, and that has now shrunk to just 0.2.
Why has it shrunk?
A, because of capital deepening. What has happened is in the so-called sectors that attracted a lot of labor, a lot of jobs, for example in manufacturing or in say textiles and things like that, even there, because a lot of capital has gone in, the propensity to attract or create employment for labor has gone down. So we need to understand that aspect as well. And also, I think this capital issue plus the servicization of manufacturing has also distorted the way we look and capture the data.
So, Make in India has not been a success, but would that have been a solution for the jobs problem, you think?
Look, I think jobs needs growth. So we need to up our growth ante from the current 7.2, 7.4% sustainably over a period of time to the 8.5. So that's the first, the sunshine that needs to be thrown onto the job segment. Whether it's Make in India itself will directly create jobs is an issue to be looked at more carefully, because I mean, as Sachin mentioned, I mean, with increasing automation now, with the increasing use of new digital technologies, etc., the number of people that are required for consistent quality standards which we need for our exports markets. So that probably will not directly create jobs. But if we get growth, then that entire services ecosystem that will come out of that manufacturing is likely to be the catchment pool.
So the gig economy is the answer, you're saying. But Mr. Sanyal, do you think that enough attention, is jobs a big issue in this election, or are you feeling that not enough attention is being paid to it?
Well, it's an ongoing process. It's not only question of one particular election getting a lot of issues, and you cannot really get a solution around an election time. So if you see in case of India, as in terms of steady questions, a politician when he faces his electorate, it's inflation and unemployment are the two steady pure economics question the politician would have to face. Yes. So it doesn't really lose its importance at any point of time, but given that one particular aspect has been managed slightly better, possibly the focus is coming back a little more on this. But I don't think this will actually get it will be peaking at the time of one particular election. It will be coming off. It will remain some kind of a steady issue for a pretty long time.
Yeah, so let me come to a related topic. You know, when we talk about unemployment and jobless growth, the redistribution is emerging as a big topic in this election. PM Kisan, Nyay, universal basic income. I mean, these are all buzzwords which are not there, you know, let's say even a year ago, so to speak. So, but do you think that the Indian economy is strong enough for redistribution to happen?
Well, redistribution to some extent you have to do. Because you cannot have a situation where you will there are certain inherent imbalances in the economy, and the skewness in the economy everywhere globally with time it's increasing. So you have to address some bit of social distribution or income redistribution issue, no doubt about that. The question is, when we are trying to do that, we need to be mindful that there is not unlimited, the government doesn't have unlimited resources. So some of the subsidies which had been there in existence for a while, possibly you have to rationalize some of them and try to put them in use here and try to target it better. If you do that, possibly that's a good thing. Otherwise, this will also get into some kind of a stumbling block and will possibly not reach its goal.
Spoken like a true economist is talking about the fiscal deficit. So, but does that mean that a better strategy would be to grow the pie before you start redistributing? I mean, how does it work?
I think, as he said, there is no magic bullet for this. But one thing we must note is that India's population is too large to keep just redistributing. You eventually have to look at the pie, growing the pie. What we mean is looking at raising the nominal GDP growth itself. Now, a couple of things here. Countries that have tried to do this redistribution, and this is the global experience, their tax to GDP ratios have been north of 25%. If I combine India's center as well as state government, the tax to GDP is about 17 odd %. So we are actually writing laws and mandating expenditure, increasing these line items and in enhancing future expenditure at a very, very low comparable tax to GDP. This is something that we should be mindful of. The second is, do you have the scope of rejigging or rationalizing expenditure? Sadly, our experience so far has been that the political economy does not really allow for major contraction or stoppage of some of these. So therefore, when you put this together, I don't really think that you can only look at redistribution. You'll have to grow the pie. And at the same time, I think you have to raise the tax to GDP. If I look at the last 20 years average, the core tax to GDP ratio has been 7.5%. I'm talking about 2-decade average. And that has refused to grow. Unless you grow the top line, there'll be very little left to distribute.
But that's easier said than done, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, look at the composition of the expenditure that the government has. 75 to 76% is not really in the hands of the government. I mean, it's non-discretionary in that sense. And therefore, just about a quarter of what you get is, in terms of revenue, is left for capital expenditure or other expenditure. So I think, yes, politically very, very tough. But if you look at it in terms of global experience, India's inclusive policies have begun much ahead of what we are seeing right now in the West and other comparable countries. But at the same time, it is starting at a much lower tax to GDP ratio.
So, Bhattacharya, would you like to add to that? What is an efficient way for redistribution?
Redistribution. No, so I mean, redistribution, as both of them said, I think it's very, very important for a relatively poor country, lower income country, without any stable social safety nets, etc. So I think an element of redistribution is important. So one thing, redistribution has to be seen in the context of the overall framework for government subventions, government subsidies, government interventions, etc. So it has to be looked upon as a package. I don't think we have sufficient resources. So, but now we probably need to get sufficient resources. And as we've just heard, there are certain limits on the amount of tax that the government can raise. I think we are already, particularly the middle classes, middle income families are already taxed relative to the resources that are given back to the families. I think we are one of the highest taxed countries in the world. I mean, it's not just a matter of the total tax to GDP ratio. The consuming power, discretionary income power is very, very high. So given this, the government would need more resources, and these resources will have to come in from other ways, creative ways of monetizing government assets.
We are already seeing a lot of creative ways of managing the fiscal deficit. Would a slightly higher fiscal deficit hurt if it solves this redistribution problem?
I do not think the fiscal deficit will be able to bear too much stress anyway, because you've already seen interest rates go up very, very sharply. No, I'm talking about monetizing land, monetizing the government buildings, monetizing various government services, etc. That's what needs to be looked at much more carefully to raise resources.
Yes, but divestment has not really been a success also.
It hasn't. Also, I think we need to keep this in mind. The line items that you keep on adding in terms of redistribution, the net present value of that should be taken into consideration. As he pointed out, right, you're already at the limits of your fiscal capacity. But if you are guaranteeing some kind of expenditure, and tomorrow some of these schemes get linked to, say, WPI or CPI, I think we need to be cognizant of the value, I mean the net present value of these line items.
So redistribution is inflationary?
Well, it again depends that whether you are actually ultimately shelling out a lot of money out of the government exchequer. If that is the case, continuously infusing more money in the system, and mind it, this particular kind of money infusion, because it's going to the poorest section of the population, the propensity to consume out of that particular income is extremely high, possibly close to 100%. So that can be inflationary. That's why you have to see it in an overall context of trying to contain the overall expansion of fiscal spending, or maybe trying to garner more resources from some of the other sides. But if you don't do that, just go for significantly larger chunk of expenditure, then it can be potentially over a period of time.
Can be done. So let me switch topics again, and this is leading from something which you said when we were talking about jobless growth. You were talking about employment surveys. So this is another topic in the elections from the economic point of view, which is about sanctity of data. 108 economists wrote a letter saying that data, we should have proper data. Then I think 150 chartered accountants wrote a letter in rebuttal. But I mean, I have just one question here. Let me come to you first. See, we all know that Chinese data is suspect. That former Prime Minister of China, Li Qiang, he came up with his own index. We still have a lot of money pouring into China in terms of investments. So, the sanctity of data, is it something only statisticians and economists care about?
I think any data point, right? I mean, especially when it comes to macro data, it could be any country, any index number. You can raise any number of questions. And it's also a fact of life that some of these will undergo some revisions. And therefore, a like-to-like comparison at times becomes very, very difficult. Second is at inflection points, again, trying to capture something which is as huge as the GDP or I mean, as for a large economy like India, which is unorganized and organized, it becomes extremely difficult. So I guess the point to make here is we are going through this inflection point. We've had several disruptive economic policies, and the economy is still trying to grapple. And if you look at businesses, business models are undergoing a change. So therefore, to pinpoint a particular data set or data point, it becomes difficult. And therefore, I mean, we are 3 economists here. You spoke about 108. You'll get 6 views here again, I mean, on the same thing. But the point I'm making is, forget the accurate capture of data or making sense. What we do is all of us use several proxies, anecdotes, information, and try to make sense of the underlying growth or the macro numbers. So I think for anybody to make sense of the numbers and statistics, we need to rely on a lot more than just the underlying data.
Underlying data. So, Mr. Bhattacharya, how do you assess how do you get the feel of the economy? I mean, apart from the official numbers, of course.
So again, I mean, of course, you have to match high frequency numbers. Look, I mean, the thing about this data issue that has come up, currently, I mean, over the last couple of years, particularly since the new GDP numbers were put in place, the new base of the GDP. I mean, data sets in India have become so much better, so much deeper. So there is a priori not really too many reasons for doubting the quality. I have a feeling that quality of the data will only have improved over the past 2 or 3 years, particularly since with the MCA 21 database, etc. So I mean, you have a larger pool of data. High frequency data is measured better now. So that's one thing, one other thing, which is what we do in terms of the revisions that we were talking about. I think because of the huge amount
demonetization
of data,
year growth was upwards of 8%.
No, remember with that demonetization, that's a very good example. The first 2 quarters of demonetization were the very high growth numbers, 10% plus. The demonetization quarter, it came in at November, so it would probably not have had as much effects as this. Came down significantly, but the sharpest deceleration was in the 4th quarter. So the high 8.2% growth number was essentially the phenomenon of Q1 and Q2. So not so much post demonetization. So there are ways when you actually dig a little deeper into the data, which you can find out some congruence of the data with some of the high frequency numbers that you see. In many of these things in India, we typically use a year-on-year methodology, which also includes many base effects, biases, skews, etc. So all of that. Going forward, I think we are in a very good position. With the databases now that are being put in place, the GST data in particular, I actually say this in many interviews that we probably will not need a CSO in 5 years from now. The entire GST structure will throw up such high quality data on economic activity that you will only need surveys and stuff at the sidelines. The core data on economic activity will provide you a very good idea of what economic activity will be like.
Do you share the same optimism?
Well, I'll put it this way. In case of India, or for that matter, in case of any country, any activity which is sufficiently formalized, it's easier to collate and analyze that particular data. Unfortunately, in case of India, and for real economic activity, that part is still, that involves quite a bit of informal sector. Now, one thing, as Sogat also mentioned, as Sachin also mentioned, that we are moving towards greater formalization, which is a good thing. So that way, capturing and analyzing and collating that particular chunk will be that much more easier over a period of time. And at the same time, given that all these disruptive reforms impacted the informal sector a lot more, assessing the exact impact there had been possibly a lot more difficult than what people at large appreciate. So possibly we have to take all these factors into cognizance before jumping into any conclusion.
Okay. So far we've been talking about issues around the elections. Now let us gaze a little ahead into a crystal ball, so to speak. Mr. Bhattacharya, let me come to you first. New government comes to power in June. Okay. Everybody is talking about this, Gen Next reforms. What are these Gen Next reforms, or is it just hot air, fancy terms used by economists and journalists?
So let me throw out yet another controversial statement now. I think to a very large extent, I mean, we've probably gone through the large policy reforms, a lot of the large policy reforms, the GSTs, the tax structures, the IBCs. There are a couple, I mean, areas which have been virtually left untouched, land and labor. I probably cannot foresee too many developments on the policy front in these areas. So I think the key things that we now need to do is to consolidate all the big policy reforms that we have seen. Any corporate will tell you, oh, you're going to have policies, strategies and so on. Ultimately, it will come down for those policies to deliver on the ground. It has to be execution. So right now, I think the next set of reforms will need to focus on the microeconomics, on the microstructures, on the implementation parts, the little nuts and bolts, the details of the last mile hindrances.
Give us an example of when you say microstructure and the microeconomic.
It's very simple. Say tax is a very important issue now. So one of the big policy areas with GST that's been taken care of, it's work in progress, but we'll get to a reasonable structure. So tax, I mean, the recent things on the e-commerce policies, the tax structures, etc., retrospective changes in policies, particularly tax policies on e-commerce. It is precisely these things which impede investment, and we need a lot of foreign investment. The case of Walmart, say for instance, which was a very good inflow into FDI inflow into the country, I think those are areas where particularly in the, I'm not saying on the issues on the last level linkages of electricity and so on. I mean, some of these areas, tax is a very, very large area. I mean, there's been tax changes in all countries across the world where governments are trying to pin down in this era of electronic digital companies. These are areas, so last minute changes in taxes, signing of advanced pricing agreements, say for instance, is precisely an area of the microstructure that we need to take care of.
So it's almost becoming like a big bang versus steady state argument. He's in favor of steady state. Are you in favor of big bang reforms?
I guess I agree. I mean, execution has been the bane for the economy. We've seen a lot of reforms, big ticket. It's been, I mean, since the 1991 reforms, I mean, we've come a long way. And reforms is a journey, right? Going forward, I think, as he rightly said, execution. But I would want to highlight a couple of areas where we need some quick work from the government. The first is trade policy. I mean, look at the way, there's a very interesting chart from WTO, wherein the number of times India has been hauled up by the US and the EU in WTO regarding trade disputes is second only to China. And in this whole euphoria of India being the fastest growing economy of its size and everything, and whatever 10 trillion by 2030, we forget that we still have a long way to go. And if at all this actually fructifies in the time frame, we will not be entitled to a lot of these subsidies and the benefits that we get at the trade forum globally, and especially from the developed economies. Most of these will go away. We'll have to rejig our subsidy regime, not only from a fiscal standpoint, but from a trade standpoint as well. And therefore, I think looking at the way the world is, I mean, the world is closing for business when we actually most need it. We will need to rejig the trade policy very quickly. We'll also have to get into bilaterals as well as multilateral trade treaties, and therefore we need a holistic look at this. The second area is agriculture. I mean, it's something wherein, I mean, we've liberalized as an economy, but look at agriculture sector. It is still hobbled with too many, I mean, government restrictions. The government sets the markets and the prices. That's the surest way of failing in any particular sector or segment of the economy. I think you need a big liberalization drive in agriculture apart from what Shaugata mentioned.
So tax, trade and agriculture, if you were to advise a new government on one single reform, the most important to you, which one would that be?
No, I think I tend to go for the steady state and many small steps rather than trying to have one big hit out of the park. No, that's not really needed. And some of the things I cannot agree more, like for example, in case of agriculture, so we keep on talking about every time still about the minimum support prices and farmers' income coming out of higher prices and not necessarily out of higher quantum of production. But think of it, even today, what is the condition of rural storage or agricultural storage? Now you have made a good progress, for example, on rural electrification. Now, why not taking the next logical step forward and try to establish good agricultural warehouses so that you minimize loss of crops and stuff like that? Still now, there is a staggering statistics of some huge proportion of perishables and vegetables and all getting lost despite the high prices. So I think you need to try to, rather than trying to find out one glamorous solution to many problems, you try to work towards many small steps towards fixing some of the less glamorous areas, and the combined effect of that is much more than 2. There 2 plus 2 is more than 4.
Right. There we have it. There is no magic wand to India's economic problems. The next government needs to consolidate on reforms which have already taken place and take a series of small steps in areas like tax, agriculture, trade policy, etc. to take India to the next level. Thank you for watching this panel discussion from Moneycontrol. For more news and updates, stay logged on to moneycontrol.com.